Chapter 1. Whispers Among the Roses. The evening air was thick with the scent of blooming roses. Eleanor Whitlock knelt among the thorny bushes, her fingers deftly working through the soft petals and sharp stems. She had always found solace in her garden, a sanctuary of vivid colors and heady fragrances that stood in stark contrast to the muted tones of her life. Here, she could lose herself in the rhythm of pruning, weeding, and planting, her thoughts dissipating into the soil like water sinking into the earth. But tonight, the stillness felt different. The usual hum of cicadas and distant calls of owls were absent, replaced by an uncanny silence that wrapped around the estate like a shroud. Eleanor paused, a pair of pruning shears frozen mid-air. She tilted her head, listening for the familiar sounds of the night, but there was nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves stirred by an unseen breeze. The Whitlock estate had always been an isolated retreat, tucked away on the outskirts of the countryside. It was a place where time seemed to move differently, where days blurred into one another, marked only by the changing seasons. For Eleanor, this timelessness was both a comfort and a curse. It allowed her to hide from the world, to escape the questions and pitying looks that had followed her since James's death. But it also left her with an aching void that not even her beloved garden could fill. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands, and surveyed her work. The rose bushes had flourished under her care, their blossoms cascading in shades of crimson, pink, and ivory. It was a labor of love, one that James had once shared with her. Together, they had planted the first of these roses on the day they moved into the estate, a symbol of their hope for the life they would build. Now, the garden was hers alone, a bittersweet reminder of what had been and what was lost. As Eleanor turned to head back to the house, a faint sound reached her ears, a single, haunting note, like the pluck of a string or the whisper of wind through a hollow reed. She froze, her heart quickening. The sound came again, clearer this time, a low and mournful melody that seemed to drift through the air. It was coming from the direction of the old music room. The music room had been untouched for years. James had always intended to restore it, but the project had been abandoned after his passing. Eleanor had avoided it ever since, unable to face the echoes of their shared dreams that lingered there. Yet now, as the ghostly melody called to her, she felt an inexplicable pull toward the room. She hesitated, her feet rooted to the ground. The logical part of her mind told her to ignore it, to retreat to the safety of her bedroom and dismiss the sound as a trick of the wind. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, drove her forward. She picked up a lantern from the garden path and made her way toward the house, her steps cautious yet purposeful. The Whitlock estate loomed in the moonlight, its tall windows glinting like watchful eyes. Eleanor pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside, the faint creak of the hinges breaking the oppressive silence. The air inside the house was cool and faintly musty, carrying the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. The music room was at the end of a long hallway, its door slightly ajar. A sliver of pale light spilled into the corridor, illuminating the faded wallpaper and worn floorboards. As Eleanor approached, the melody grew louder, its notes weaving a tapestry of sorrow and longing that sent shivers down her spine. It was a tune she didn't recognize, yet it felt hauntingly familiar, as though it had been plucked from the recesses of her own mind. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was just as she remembered it. A grand piano dominating the space, its polished surface dulled by layers of dust, a scattering of sheet music strewn across the floor, and heavy curtains framing tall windows that overlooked the garden. But what caught her attention was the figure seated at the piano. It was a man, his back to her, his hands moving gracefully over the keys. His form was translucent, shimmering like a mirage in the dim light. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she watched him, torn between disbelief and a strange sense of calm. The music flowed from his fingers, filling the room with a melody that seemed to transcend the boundaries of time and space. "Who are you?" Eleanor's voice trembled, barely louder than a whisper. The figure stopped playing, the final note lingering in the air like a sigh. Slowly, he turned to face her, and Eleanor found herself looking into the eyes of a stranger. They were kind eyes, filled with a quiet sadness that mirrored her own. "My name is Adrian Hale," he said, his voice as ethereal as his form, "and I believe I need your help." Eleanor stared at him, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing and hearing. A ghost. A ghost was sitting at her piano, speaking to her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she felt a single tear slip down her cheek, unbidden and inexplicable. "Please," Adrian said, his voice tinged with desperation. "I've been waiting for so long. Will you listen?" And in that moment, something inside Eleanor shifted. Perhaps it was the loneliness she had carried for so long, or the echo of a long-forgotten hope stirring to life. Whatever it was, she found herself nodding, her voice barely audible as she replied, "I'm listening." Chapter 2. The Phantom's Serenade. Eleanor Whitlock's hands trembled as she set the lantern on a side table, its flickering light casting elongated shadows across the music room. The ghost, Adrian Hale, remained seated at the piano, his spectral form barely stirring the air. Though translucent, his presence felt oddly solid, as though the weight of his sorrow anchored him to the room. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, a strange mix of fear and intrigue taking hold of her. You're a ghost," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian nodded, his gaze steady but tinged with melancholy. "That much is clear. What's less clear is why you can see me when no one else could, all these years." Years. The word lingered in Eleanor's mind, heavy with implication. How long had this man, this spirit, been trapped here, playing his mournful melody to an empty room? She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "What do you want from me?" "Your help," Adrian said, his tone as gentle as the music he had been playing. "I'm bound to this place, unable to move on until I finish my work. My symphony. It's incomplete, and I can't rest until it's done." Eleanor frowned, confusion clouding her features. "But why me? I'm no musician. I wouldn't even know where to begin." Adrian's gaze softened. "You're more attuned to the world than you realize. Your garden is proof of that. Life blooms under your care, Eleanor. Perhaps you can help bring my music to life as well." Eleanor shook her head, retreating a step. "This is madness. I've spent years trying to bury the past, to avoid the pain of loss. And now you expect me to, what? Collaborate with a ghost?" Adrian stood, his form gliding rather than stepping around the piano. His expression was earnest, almost pleading. "I don't expect anything. I'm simply asking. You've known loss, Eleanor. You understand what it means to carry something unfinished. Help me, and perhaps you'll find some healing, too." His words struck a chord she couldn't ignore. Eleanor's breath hitched as memories of James surged to the surface. His laughter, his gentle hands guiding hers as they planted the first rosebush, his voice promising a lifetime of shared dreams. And then the emptiness that had followed, the silence that had settled over her life like an unwelcome guest. "All right," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I'll listen, but I can't promise more than that." Adrian's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's more than I could have hoped for." The following days blurred into an unusual routine. By day, Eleanor tended to her garden, her hands finding solace in the soil while her mind wrestled with the surreal reality of her evenings. By night, she would meet Adrian in the music room, where his ghostly hands coaxed melodies from the piano, fragments of a symphony that was as haunting as its composer. "This part," Adrian said one evening, gesturing to a set of sheet music that lay on the piano bench, "is where I always falter. The notes feel empty, as though something vital is missing." Eleanor studied the page, though the intricacies of musical notation were lost on her. "What were you feeling when you wrote it?" she asked. Adrian's expression darkened, his gaze distant. Regret, longing, a love that was never fully realized. Eleanor hesitated, her own heart aching at his words. "Maybe that's the problem. You're writing from a place of pain, but music doesn't have to be perfect. Maybe it just has to be honest." Adrian's eyes met hers, a flicker of hope sparking within their ethereal depths. "Honest," he repeated, as though testing the word. "You may be right, but how does one translate honesty into sound?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "The same way I translate love into a garden. You let it flow naturally. Don't overthink it." He nodded, returning to the piano. This time, the melody that emerged was softer, less structured, but infused with a raw emotion that resonated in Eleanor's chest. She closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her like a gentle rain. For the first time, she felt the faintest glimmer of something she had thought lost forever: hope. As the days turned into weeks, their collaboration deepened. Eleanor found herself opening up to Adrian in ways she hadn't thought possible. She told him about James, about the life they had dreamed of building together and the emptiness that had followed his sudden death. Adrian listened, his presence a steady comfort, his understanding unspoken but deeply felt. In return, Adrian shared fragments of his own story. He had been a celebrated composer in his time, known for his passion and brilliance. But his heart had always belonged to a woman who had inspired his greatest works, a love that had ended in tragedy. His unfinished symphony was meant to be a tribute to her, a final expression of a love that had transcended the boundaries of life and death. "I thought completing it would bring me peace," he admitted one evening, his voice tinged with regret. "But perhaps it's not the music itself that matters. Perhaps it's the act of sharing it with someone who understands." Eleanor looked at him, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Then let's finish it together," she said softly. "Not for the past, but for the present. For the beauty we can still create." Adrian's smile was luminous, a fleeting glimpse of the man he had once been. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose, a reason to step out of the shadows and into the light. But as the final notes of their symphony began to take shape, so too did the questions that lingered in the back of Eleanor's mind. What would happen when the music was complete? Would Adrian finally move on, leaving her alone once more? And if he did, could she bear to say goodbye to the only soul who truly understood her? The answers remained elusive, hidden within the growing melody that bound them together. Yet Eleanor knew one thing for certain. The garden she had so carefully cultivated was no longer her only sanctuary. The music room, with its ghostly serenades and whispered confessions, had become a place of healing, a bridge between two worlds. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 3: Roots of Loneliness. The days grew shorter, and the crisp edge of autumn crept into the air, brushing the garden with hues of amber and gold. Eleanor stood by the rose bushes, their vibrant blooms now tinged with the soft decay of the changing season. Her pruning shears hovered above a wilting petal, but her thoughts were far from the garden's upkeep. Each evening spent with Adrian in the music room had deepened the strange bond between them. Their collaboration on his unfinished symphony had transformed from a task into a shared ritual, something intimate and unspoken. Yet, for all the solace their nights brought her, questions about Adrian's past and the circumstances of his untimely demise lingered in Eleanor's mind, unanswered and persistent. The morning light filtered through the canopy of trees as Eleanor made her way toward the old greenhouse, a structure she rarely visited. It stood on the far edge of the estate, its glass panes clouded with grime and vines crawling over its iron frame like fingers gripping a secret. James had always planned to restore it, but much like the music room, it had fallen into neglect after his death. Now, it beckoned her with an almost magnetic pull. Eleanor hesitated at the door, her hand resting on the rusted handle. She couldn't explain why she had come here, only that something, or someone, seemed to be urging her. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, and a rush of cool, damp air greeted her. Inside, the greenhouse was a world unto itself. Ferns and wildflowers grew unchecked, their roots twisting through cracked stone tiles. Shafts of light pierced through the grime-covered glass, illuminating the chaos in fragmented brilliance. At the center of the space stood an old table, its wooden surface warped and weathered by time. On it lay a scattering of objects: rusted gardening tools, a faded notebook, and a violin case coated in a thin layer of dust. Eleanor's breath caught as she approached the table, her gaze fixed on the violin case. With trembling hands, she unlatched it and lifted the lid. Inside lay an exquisite instrument, its varnish gleaming despite the years of neglect. A bow rested alongside it, its horsehair brittle and yellowed with age. "Adrian," she murmured, the name escaping her lips before she could stop herself. The air seemed to shift, the silence deepening until it felt alive. Eleanor's pulse quickened as a faint melody filled the greenhouse, a haunting tune that seemed to emanate from the violin itself. She turned sharply, half expecting to see Adrian standing behind her, but she was alone. The music grew louder, its notes wrapping around her like a whisper carried on the wind. Eleanor clutched the violin, her grip tightening as a wave of emotion washed over her. The melody was both unfamiliar and achingly familiar, as though it had always existed in the corners of her memory, waiting to be heard. "Eleanor." She spun around, her heart leaping at the sound of Adrian's voice. He stood in the doorway, his translucent form shimmering in the dim light. His gaze was fixed on the violin, an expression of longing and sorrow etched onto his face. "It was hers," he said softly, stepping into the greenhouse. "The woman I loved. Lydia." Eleanor's fingers loosened their grip on the violin as she turned to face him fully. "Lydia?" she repeated, the name heavy on her tongue. Adrian nodded, his gaze distant. She was a violinist, brilliant and beautiful. This was her instrument. She played it during our last concert together. The night before, he trailed off, his voice faltering. "Before what?" Eleanor prompted gently. Adrian's eyes met hers, and the weight of his grief was almost palpable. "Before the fire. It swept through the theater while we were rehearsing. I tried to save her, but it was too late. I perished alongside her." Eleanor's heart ached at the raw pain in his voice. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't imagine the pain you've carried all this time." Adrian gave a faint, bittersweet smile. "It's why I'm still here. My symphony was meant to be a tribute to her, to our love. But I couldn't finish it in life, and it seems I'm bound to this place until I do." Eleanor looked down at the violin, her mind racing. "What if this is the key?" she said, her voice gaining strength. "What if Lydia's violin can help us complete the symphony?" Adrian's gaze sharpened, a flicker of hope igniting in his eyes. "It's possible," he said slowly. "Her music was the heart of my work. If you can play it." Eleanor blinked, her confidence faltering. "Me? I've never played a violin in my life." Adrian stepped closer, his presence both comforting and commanding. "I can guide you," he said. You don't need to be perfect, Eleanor. You just need to be willing. She hesitated, the weight of the violin heavy in her hands. But as she looked into Adrian's eyes, she felt a strange certainty settle over her. This was why she had been drawn to the greenhouse, why she had found the violin. It was more than chance. It was destiny. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. All right, show me. Adrian's smile was soft but radiant, and as he reached out to position her fingers on the strings, Eleanor felt a spark of warmth pass through her. The melody that followed was halting and uneven, but it carried with it a resonance that seemed to awaken something deep within her soul. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt alive. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Moonlight. The evening air was heavy with the scent of damp earth as Eleanor stepped into the music room. The faint hum of cicadas filtered through the cracked windows, blending with the warmth of candlelight that softened the room's shadows. She held Lydia's violin in her hands, its weight oddly comforting now, though its presence still carried an air of reverence she couldn't quite shake. Adrian was already at the piano, his translucent form more vibrant tonight, as though the act of teaching her had restored some part of his faded vitality. His fingers lingered over the keys, not pressing but hovering as if testing the air for inspiration. He turned to her with a small smile as she entered. "You came," he said softly. Eleanor returned the smile, setting the violin case down carefully on the bench beside her. "I'm nothing if not persistent," she replied, though the flicker of doubt in her voice betrayed her. Adrian's gaze softened, and he gestured for her to take her place beside him. "Persistence is all music requires. That and honesty." She nodded, drawing the violin from its case and lifting it to her shoulder. The bow felt foreign in her hand, its weight awkward as she struggled to find the proper grip. Adrian moved closer, his presence cool and faint but undeniably real. He adjusted her fingers gently, his touch like a whisper of wind brushing over her skin. "Relax," he murmured. "The music will come when you let it." Eleanor closed her eyes, inhaling deeply to calm the tremor in her hands. When she drew the bow across the strings, the first sound that emerged was jagged, a dissonant scratch that made her wince. She opened her eyes, cheeks flushing with embarrassment, but Adrian only smiled. "Every beginning is imperfect," he said. "Try again." This time, Eleanor steadied her hand and let the bow glide more gently. A single note rang out, pure and resonant. It filled the room, lingering in the air like a held breath. She felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name, a mix of pride and longing that brought tears to her eyes. "Better," Adrian said, his voice warm with encouragement. "Now let's try this." He began to hum a melody, the same haunting tune that had echoed in the greenhouse when she first found the violin. Eleanor's hands moved instinctively, the notes rising and falling as though the music had been etched into her soul long before this moment. Her playing was tentative but earnest, each stroke of the bow drawing her deeper into the melody's embrace. Adrian's gaze never left her, his expression one of quiet awe. "You're feeling it," he said, more to himself than to her. "The connection." Eleanor paused, lowering the violin. "What connection?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and a hint of unease. Adrian's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the room seemed to still. "Music isn't just sound," he said. "It's memory, emotion. It carries the essence of those who create it and those who hear it. When you play, you're not just performing. You're reaching into something greater, something eternal." His words sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. She looked at the violin in her hands, its polished wood gleaming in the candlelight. It was no longer just an instrument. It was a vessel, a bridge between worlds. As the night wore on, their collaboration deepened. Adrian's guidance was patient, his presence a steady reassurance. Eleanor's confidence grew with each note, her movements becoming more fluid, her connection to the music more profound. By the time she set the violin down, the room was filled with a warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Adrian stood by the piano, his expression contemplative. "You've done more tonight than I thought possible," he said. "The melody is beginning to take shape." Eleanor smiled, though exhaustion weighed heavy on her. "It's your music," she said. "I'm just the one playing it." He shook his head. "No, it's ours now. Music is a collaboration, Eleanor, even across time. You've given it a voice I could never have imagined." She looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and something deeper, something she couldn't yet name. But as her gaze lingered on his spectral form, a pang of sadness pierced her chest. Adrian was here, but not truly. And when the music was finished, what would become of him? "Adrian," she began, her voice hesitant, "when the symphony is complete, will you leave?" His expression grew solemn, and he looked away, his translucent form seeming to dim slightly. "That's the hope," he said quietly. "To find peace, to move on." Eleanor's throat tightened. She nodded, though the thought of losing him left her feeling hollow. "Then we'll make it perfect," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "For Lydia, for you." Adrian's gaze softened, and he reached out as though to touch her cheek. His hand passed through her, but she felt a faint, fleeting warmth that lingered long after he pulled away. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, "for everything." As Eleanor lay in bed that night, the echoes of their music still resonating in her mind, she found herself staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a tangled web of emotions. Adrian had become more than just a ghost seeking her help. He was a presence that filled the void James had left, a companion who understood her grief and shared her passions. But he was also a reminder of impermanence, a fleeting connection that could vanish as suddenly as it had appeared. And as much as she tried to focus on the music, on the work they had yet to complete, a part of her couldn't help but wonder. When the final note was played, would she be left in silence once more? Chapter 5. A Melody from the Beyond. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm, like the syncopated beats of a hesitant melody. Eleanor's days were spent tending to the garden, where the autumn leaves fell in vibrant cascades, carpeting the earth in shades of ochre and crimson. But her nights belonged to the music. Adrian's presence had become a comforting constant, his voice guiding her through the complexities of his unfinished symphony. Yet, with every passing evening, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the music carried with it something darker, a shadow of the past that refused to be silenced. One such night, as Eleanor stood in the music room adjusting the strings of Lydia's violin, a sense of unease prickled at the edges of her awareness. The candlelight flickered more than usual, casting restless shadows that danced along the walls. Adrian sat at the piano, his ethereal fingers gliding over the keys in a silent rehearsal of a passage they had been struggling with. "Adrian," Eleanor said, breaking the stillness, "does it ever feel like something else is here with us?" He paused, his form wavering slightly as he turned to her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, unsure how to articulate the feeling. "It's hard to explain. Sometimes it feels like the air changes, like the room itself is listening. It's not just us, or the music. It's something more." Adrian's expression grew thoughtful, his gaze drifting toward the darkened corners of the room. "The past leaves echoes," he said finally, "especially in places like this, where emotions ran deep. Perhaps you're sensing them." Eleanor's grip on the violin tightened. "But why now? Why would these echoes stir after all this time?" Before Adrian could answer, a sudden chill swept through the room, extinguishing one of the candles. The darkness deepened, and Eleanor's breath caught as a faint sound reached her ears. A whisper, low and indistinct, like words carried on a gust of wind. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Adrian's form grew more solid as his attention sharpened. He moved toward her, his expression tense. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm. The whisper grew louder, forming fragments of a melody that twisted and turned, eerie and dissonant. Eleanor's heart pounded as she scanned the room, her eyes catching movement in the large, gilt-framed mirror that hung above the fireplace. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure, a shadowy outline that wasn't hers or Adrian's. "The mirror," she whispered, pointing. Adrian followed her gaze, his expression darkening. "It's a threshold," he said quietly, "a place where the veil between worlds is thin. Be careful, Eleanor." The whispering ceased abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Eleanor stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with wide, frightened eyes. But as she leaned in, something shifted. Her reflection seemed to ripple, and for a brief moment, it wasn't her own face she saw, it was Lydia's. Eleanor staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. "Adrian, I saw her," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was Lydia. Adrian's form flickered, his expression unreadable. "She's trying to reach us," he said. "Or something is using her image to deceive us." The idea sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. Why would someone do that? Adrian moved closer, his presence steadying her. "The music," he said. "It's not just a tribute. It's a key. And if Lydia's spirit is tied to it, then others may be as well. Not all of them will want to see it completed." Eleanor's mind raced as she tried to make sense of his words. She looked back at the mirror, now still and unremarkable. "What do we do?" she asked. Adrian's gaze hardened. "We keep going," he said. "We finish the symphony. But you must be careful, Eleanor. The closer we get, the more the shadows will stir." The following night, Eleanor's steps felt heavier as she made her way to the music room. The violin case was clasped tightly in her hands, and Adrian's warning echoed in her mind. She paused at the door, her pulse quickening as she reached for the handle. When she stepped inside, she was greeted by a sight that took her breath away. The room was bathed in a soft, golden glow, as though the air itself was alight. Adrian stood by the piano, his form more solid than ever before, his presence commanding and almost alive. But it wasn't just him. The mirror above the fireplace shimmered, its surface rippling like water. "Eleanor," Adrian said, his voice filled with urgency. "Play." She hesitated, her gaze darting between him and the mirror. "What's happening?" she asked. "There isn't time to explain," he said. "The music is the only way to stabilize it. Trust me." Her hands trembled as she lifted the violin and drew the bow across the strings. The first note was shaky, but as she played, the melody came to her like an old friend, guiding her fingers with a confidence she hadn't known she possessed. The glow in the room intensified, and the mirror's surface began to clear, revealing a vision of a grand theater engulfed in flames. Eleanor's breath hitched as she saw figures moving through the inferno, musicians clutching their instruments, their faces etched with terror. At the center of it all was Lydia, her violin clutched tightly in her hands as she played a desperate tune. The vision was so vivid, so real, that Eleanor felt the heat of the flames on her skin. "Keep going," Adrian urged, his voice cutting through her fear. She poured herself into the music, each note a lifeline that anchored her to the present. The vision in the mirror began to shift, the flames receding to reveal a stage bathed in light. Lydia stood there, her expression serene as she lowered her violin and turned to face Eleanor. "Thank you," Lydia's voice echoed, faint and distant. But the work isn't finished yet. The mirror's surface stilled, and the glow in the room faded. Eleanor lowered the violin, her hands trembling as she looked at Adrian. His expression was a mixture of pride and sorrow. "What was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "A memory," he said, "and a message. Lydia's spirit is guiding us, Eleanor. But there's more to uncover, more to face." Eleanor swallowed hard, her resolve strengthening despite the fear that lingered in her chest. "Then we'll face it," she said. "Together." Adrian's smile was faint but filled with gratitude. "Together," he echoed, and for the first time, Eleanor felt that they might truly succeed, even if the shadows in the mirror had only just begun to stir. Chapter 6. Beneath the wisteria veil. Eleanor's life settled into an uneasy rhythm. Each day she would work in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, the scent of earth and fading leaves grounding her in the present. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the grounds, she found herself drawn to the music room. The unfinished symphony had become a beacon, a task that tethered her to Adrian and the lingering mystery of Lydia. One evening, Eleanor stood by the window in the music room, gazing out at the garden. The great willow tree at its heart swayed gently in the autumn breeze, its branches brushing the ground like a ghostly curtain. The air carried a faint chill, and the silence was thick enough to touch. Adrian's faint presence at the piano filled the room with a quiet sense of companionship, though he hadn't yet spoken that night. "It's strange," Eleanor said finally, her voice breaking the stillness. "The garden feels different at night, almost alive." Adrian's form shimmered into visibility, his spectral hands poised over the piano keys. "It's because the veil is thinner here," he said, his tone thoughtful. "The willow, it holds memories, residues of those who once walked these grounds." Eleanor turned to him, her brow furrowing. "Memories?" "The willow's roots run deep, entwined with the past," Adrian explained. "It's a sentinel of sorts. If you listen closely, you might hear its whispers." A shiver ran down Eleanor's spine, though it wasn't entirely unpleasant. She found herself drawn to his words, her curiosity piqued. "Have you heard them?" Adrian's gaze drifted toward the window, his expression unreadable. "Once or twice, but the whispers are faint, like a melody carried on the wind. If you truly wish to hear them, you'll have to go to the willow yourself." Eleanor hesitated. The idea of venturing into the garden at night both intrigued and unnerved her. But as she looked at Adrian's ethereal form, something in his eyes told her this was important. Later that evening, Eleanor wrapped herself in a thick shawl and stepped into the cool night. The garden stretched out before her, bathed in the silvery light of the moon. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint rustle of leaves. She made her way to the willow, its branches swaying gently as though beckoning her closer. Standing beneath the tree, Eleanor placed a hand on its rough bark. The wood felt warm, almost alive, and a strange vibration pulsed beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes and focused on the stillness, her breathing slowing as she tried to attune herself to the whispers Adrian had mentioned. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then, faintly, she heard it, a soft murmur, indistinct and fragmented. Words she couldn't quite make out danced on the edges of her awareness, tantalizing and elusive. "Who's there?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. The whispers grew clearer, forming fragments of phrases. "Lost time. The fire. The symphony must live." Her heart raced as the fragments coalesced into a single voice, a woman's voice, melodic yet tinged with sorrow. "Eleanor," the voice said, sending a shiver down her spine. "You must not stop. The music holds the truth. It will lead you to the answer." "Lydia?" Eleanor breathed, her voice trembling. The willow's branches swayed violently, though the air was still. The voice didn't answer directly, but a vision formed in Eleanor's mind. A flash of the grand theater she'd seen in the mirror, its gilded balconies and velvet curtains vivid in her mind's eye. She saw Lydia standing on the stage, her violin raised, the fire creeping ever closer. Eleanor. The voice's sharpness startled her, and she opened her eyes to find Adrian standing a few feet away, his form more solid than ever. His expression was one of concern. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. "The willow. It has a way of pulling you in," he said. "I felt your fear. Are you all right?" Eleanor nodded, though her hands trembled. "I heard her," she said. "Lydia." She said the music holds the truth. Adrian's expression darkened. "The symphony is more than music," he said. "It's a map, a guide to understanding what happened. To Lydia, to me, to all of us." Eleanor's mind reeled as she tried to process his words. "But why me? Why am I the one who has to do this?" Adrian stepped closer, his gaze intense. "Because you have the strength to see it through," he said. "And because the willow chose you." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The vision of the theater, the fragments of Lydia's voice, and the weight of Adrian's words swirled in her mind. She sat by the window, staring out at the garden and the shadowy silhouette of the willow. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, Eleanor made a decision. She would see this through, no matter what it cost. The music was calling to her, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. The symphony had to be completed, and she would uncover the truth it held, even if it meant facing the shadows beneath the willow again. Chapter 7. Echoes of a Love Lost. The garden was different that morning. The usual hum of birds and rustling leaves had fallen to a quiet so still it seemed as if time itself had held its breath. Celine stood near the old stone fountain, her eyes tracing the movement of the water. The soft ripple, almost invisible, ran through the surface like the passing of a thought too fleeting to grasp. She had always found solace here, in the quiet corners of the garden where the flowers bloomed without expectation, their beauty untamed by human hand. But today, there was something about it, something unsettling. The air felt charged, as though a storm was waiting just beyond the horizon, even if the sky was still clear. And then, she saw him, not as she had before, an ethereal figure drifting like smoke through the branches, but solid, flesh and bone, standing at the edge of the rose bushes. His features were sharper, more defined, and yet there was a softness in his expression that she hadn't remembered. His name was never spoken aloud, not since that first evening, but in the silence of the garden, with the weight of their shared history pulling them together like an invisible thread. She knew it was him, Luca. He smiled faintly, as though this meeting were the most natural thing in the world. "Celine," he murmured, his voice a whisper among the leaves, yet it carried with it the warmth of something familiar. She didn't speak immediately. There was too much to say, too much to unravel in the space between them. The years of her life spent tending to the garden, to the house, to the memories of a life lived without him. These all surged forward, filling the spaces where silence had once reigned. "I thought you were gone," she said finally, her voice barely a breath, but laden with the heaviness of truth. Luca took a step toward her, his gaze softening as he regarded her with something that looked like sorrow, mixed with affection. "I never truly left, Celine. Not in the way you think. I've been waiting." Her heart skipped a beat at his words, but she swallowed the surge of emotions threatening to rise in her chest. "Waiting for what?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and longing. "For you to understand," he replied simply. The weight of those words pressed down on her, and for the first time in years, she felt a shift within herself. a pull she couldn't quite explain. It was as though the earth beneath her feet had suddenly tilted, revealing something hidden beneath the surface. Celine's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together in front of her. "I've lived so long without you, Luca, without any understanding of what happened. Why you had to leave, why you?" Her voice cracked, the words unsaid hanging heavy in the air. "I didn't want to," he said, his voice thick with regret. "But sometimes, the things we want aren't enough to keep us in the world we love. You've felt it too, haven't you? The way the past refuses to let go." She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The garden, once a place of solace, now seemed full of ghosts, memories of a life she had long buried. "I don't know if I can do this, Luca. If I can face everything again." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, his presence overwhelming in its intensity. "You don't have to face it alone, Celine. I'm here now." For a long moment, they stood in silence, each feeling the weight of the years that had passed, the time lost between them. But in that silence, there was also something else, a connection, a spark of something undeniable. Celine didn't know what to say. Words felt so small in the face of the emotions swirling within her. But as she looked into his eyes, she felt the stirrings of something deeper, something that had always been there but had been hidden by time and sorrow. "I'm not sure I can trust you again," she whispered. Luca's gaze softened. "I know, but I've never stopped loving you, Celine, and I never will." The words hung in the air between them, charged with an intensity that seemed to echo throughout the garden. And as Celine looked around at the flowers, the trees, the stones, she realized that she had always known he would return. The garden, in its quiet way, had been waiting too. Chapter 8: The Garden of Secrets. The sun had begun its slow descent into the horizon, casting long shadows over the garden that seemed to stretch and curl like forgotten memories. The stillness of the afternoon hung thick in the air, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for her. Celine stood in the garden, her hands brushing lightly over the petals of the roses as her thoughts churned. Luca had been gone again, as suddenly as he had appeared. His absence felt as tangible as his presence, and she found herself aching for the quiet that followed him. Yet, beneath that ache, there was something else, something new, a stirring in her heart, a longing she had buried for so long it had almost been forgotten. The garden, which had always been her sanctuary, now felt like an enigma. The familiar paths, the ivy-clad trellises, the familiar hum of the earth beneath her feet. It all seemed to hold secrets she hadn't known were there. But Luca's return had stirred something within her, unlocking memories and emotions she had long since sealed away. And now, in the fading light of day, she found herself at the same stone fountain where they had spoken just hours before. The water no longer rippled in the same way it had earlier. It seemed still, almost stagnant, as though mirroring the stillness that had overtaken her soul. "Why now?" she whispered into the air, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of 1,000 unasked questions. As if in answer, a rustle of movement caught her attention. Her gaze flicked to the shadows, where the familiar form of Luca appeared once again, this time not standing in the open, but hidden beneath the canopy of an ancient oak tree. His figure was outlined against the dimming sky, but his eyes, those eyes that she had once known so well, shone with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're here," she said, more to herself than to him. Luca's gaze never wavered. "I never left," he replied, his voice a soft whisper that seemed to brush against the very air around her. Celine's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "I don't understand. I thought you were gone for good, that I had moved on, that everything, was over. He took a step forward, his presence filling the space between them with an overwhelming intensity. "You never truly moved on, Celine," he said, his voice thick with regret. "Not in the way you think. There are things in this world, things that go beyond time, that bind us together. And no matter how much you try to run from it, no matter how much you bury the past, it will always come back." Celine felt a chill run down her spine as his words sank in. Was this what she had been feeling all along? That nagging pull, that aching sense that something was missing, something unfinished? She had spent so many years burying the past, building walls around herself to protect her heart. But now, standing here in front of Luca, she realized how fragile those walls had been. "I don't know if I can bear it again, Luca," she admitted softly, her voice trembling. "The pain, the loss, everything that happened, it nearly destroyed me." Luca's eyes softened with a sorrow that seemed to stretch across the years. He took another step forward, now standing just a few feet from her. "I never meant for that to happen, Celine. I never meant to hurt you. But some things are beyond our control. Some things happen, and we have no choice but to face them." Her breath caught in her throat as she reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against his hand. The touch was electric, sending a wave of warmth flooding through her body. It felt both new and ancient, as if nothing had changed between them, as if the years of separation had not happened at all. "I've lived so long without you," she murmured, her eyes searching his face. "I've convinced myself that I didn't need you anymore, that I could be whole without you. And yet," Luca whispered, his voice barely audible, "here we are, still bound to each other, even after everything. Because deep down, you've always known that I never truly left." She didn't know how to respond to that. The words he spoke felt too true, too raw. She had spent so much time pretending that she could forget, that she could move on. But there was no escaping the reality of what they had shared. It was like a thread, woven into the very fabric of her being, and no matter how far she ran, it would always pull her back. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this again, Luca," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can bear the weight of the past on my shoulders anymore." Luca stepped closer, closing the space between them. His gaze never left hers, his eyes filled with a mix of love and sorrow. "You don't have to do it alone, Celine. I'll be here, for as long as you'll let me. Together, we can face the past, and maybe, just maybe, we can heal the wounds that have torn us apart." The words hung in the air between them, a promise and a plea all at once. Celine felt the pull of his presence, the warmth of his touch, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir within her. Something that had been dormant for so long, something that felt like hope. "Maybe," she whispered, her heart beating faster now, "maybe we can." And as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, the garden seemed to sigh, as though it too had been waiting for this moment, for the return of what had been lost. Chapter 9. Notes carried by the wind. The moon hung low in the sky, a pale crescent cutting through the night like a sliver of memory. Its light bathed the garden in an ethereal glow, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to sway with the breeze, alive with secrets of their own. The once familiar paths now appeared alien under the pale light, and Celine found herself walking through them, her feet tracing old steps in the quiet that had become too loud for her heart. Luca had gone again, leaving only the faintest trace of his presence behind. His words, still fresh in her mind, echoed like a haunting lullaby. "Together, we can heal the wounds." She hadn't been able to bring herself to believe them, not yet. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to hope, and even now, standing in the quiet of the garden, the doubt gnawed at her. She paused by the stone fountain once more, gazing at the still water. The memory of their conversation played over in her mind, a delicate web of promises and unspoken truths. The garden, once a refuge, now felt like a stage, a place where too many ghosts danced on the edges of her thoughts. It had been years since Luca's disappearance, and during that time, Celine had learned to live without him. She had grown accustomed to the silence, the absence of the person who had once meant everything to her. She had buried her pain beneath the weight of routine and duty, had poured herself into the soil of the garden, coaxing life from the earth in a desperate attempt to fill the emptiness inside. But now, standing here in the quiet night, she realized how hollow it all felt. The garden had flourished, as it always did, but something was missing. A piece of herself that she hadn't known she had lost until it returned, and now, it was up to her to decide what to do with it. A soft rustling broke her from her thoughts, and her heart skipped a beat. She turned, expecting to see Luca, but the garden was empty, silent once more. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and damp earth. But it was not the wind that had drawn her attention. No, it was the soft footfall on the path behind her, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, walking in the garden. Her breath caught in her throat, and she spun around, her eyes searching the shadows for the source of the sound. It was then that she saw him, standing just beyond the garden gate, his figure outlined by the dim light of the lanterns lining the path. His face was obscured in shadow, but she knew who it was. It had to be Luca, she breathed, her voice trembling in the still air. He stepped forward into the light, and for the first time since his return, Celine saw him clearly, truly clearly. His face, once so familiar, was now sharper, more defined, his eyes darker with the weight of all that had passed between them. Yet there was still a warmth to him, something that pulled her toward him despite the wariness that still lingered in her heart. "I didn't think you'd come back tonight," she said, her voice a mix of relief and uncertainty. "After everything, after what we said." Luca's gaze softened, and he took a step closer. "You didn't think I would, did you? But you've always known, Celine. No matter what happens, we are tied to each other. You can't break a bond like ours, not even with time." Her chest tightened at his words, but she refused to look away. "But time has changed everything, Luca. I've changed. We've changed." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I know, but some things remain the same. Even when you try to bury them, to forget them, they'll always come back." Celine shook her head, the confusion swirling inside her. "I don't understand. If you're still here, if this is real, why didn't you come back sooner? Why leave me to suffer through all those years alone?" Luca's face darkened, and for a moment, he looked almost pained. "I didn't want to leave you, Celine, but there are things I can't control. I can't change what happened. I can't undo the mistakes I made, the way I left you. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Her heart ached at his words, the truth of them cutting through her defenses like a knife. The years of loneliness, of unanswered questions, of memories she had tried so desperately to suppress. Everything came rushing back. The pain, the loss, the love she had once known. It was all there, swirling in the air between them. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice betraying the strength she had so carefully constructed around herself. "I don't know if I can open myself to you the way I did before." Luca stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't ask you to. I just ask for the chance. The chance to show you that I'm here for the right reasons. The chance to show you that I never stopped loving you." Her breath caught in her throat at the rawness of his words. She wanted to believe him, so badly that it hurt. But after everything, after all the years spent waiting, she couldn't help but wonder, was it enough? The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. And yet, as she stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, Celine felt a shift, a quiet surrender. Perhaps this was what she had been waiting for, all along. Perhaps the garden, with its roots deep in the soil of the past, was the only place where healing could begin. Luca reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he cupped her face, his touch as gentle as the breeze that whispered through the leaves. "I'm here now, Celine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I won't leave again." And for the first time in so long, Celine let herself believe. Chapter 10. Tangled Vines, Tangled Hearts. The morning light crept through the dense canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows on the earth below. The air felt different now, less oppressive, as though something had shifted in the very fabric of the garden. The familiar hum of nature had returned, but it carried a new resonance, as if every leaf and petal was singing a song of renewal. Celine walked slowly through the garden, her steps deliberate, though her mind felt clouded. She could hear the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant call of birds returning to their nests. And yet, despite the peace that surrounded her, a heaviness lingered in her chest, one that she could not shake, no matter how hard she tried. Luca had been gone again, leaving behind only the faintest trace of his presence. The night before had been filled with words left unsaid, promises half-formed, and a silence that had settled between them like a thick fog. It was the silence that worried Celine the most, the kind of silence that made everything feel more uncertain, more fragile. She reached the small stone bench beneath the weeping willow, the one where she had often sat alone during those long, solitary nights. The memories of those days felt distant now, as though they belonged to another lifetime. And yet, they still clung to her, unrelenting. Sitting on the bench, she folded her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on the garden that stretched before her. It was as if the garden was waiting, too, waiting for her to make a decision, to choose a path. The delicate flowers, the ivy-covered walls, the winding paths, they all seemed to mirror her inner conflict. There was so much beauty here, so much life, but it was also filled with shadows, things that had been buried for too long. Her thoughts drifted back to Luca. His absence was a presence in itself, a heavy weight that she couldn't ignore. Even in the quiet of the garden, she felt the pull of his presence, as though he were watching from the shadows, waiting for her to acknowledge him. She couldn't help but wonder, was this what she had been waiting for? To heal, to forgive, to start again? Or was she simply fooling herself, allowing herself to fall back into a pattern of longing that could never be fulfilled? "Celine?" The voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned, her heart leaping in her chest. There, standing in the doorway of the garden gate, was Luca. His expression was unreadable, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place. "I didn't expect you so soon," she said, her voice a little shakier than she intended. Luca stepped forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "I had to see you," he said quietly. "I couldn't stay away any longer." The words hung in the air between them, both a confession and a promise. But despite the rawness of the moment, Celine felt a quiet tension building within her, a hesitation that she couldn't shake. She had wanted this, hadn't she? She had longed for his return, for the chance to speak, to understand, to finally put the pieces of the past together. And yet, standing here in front of him, she wasn't sure what came next. "You've been gone," she said softly, her eyes not meeting his. "I didn't know if I would see you again. I thought maybe it was all just a dream." Luca took a step closer, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Celine. I know I've been absent, but I've never stopped thinking about you. About us." The words hit her like a wave, sweeping away any thoughts of doubt, if only for a moment. She looked up at him then, her heart racing in her chest. There was something different in his eyes, something softer, something more real than she had seen before. But still, the silence between them stretched, as if they were both afraid to speak too loudly, to disturb the fragile thread that connected them. "What happened, Luca?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you leave me? Why did you let everything fall apart?" Luca's expression faltered, a flicker of pain crossing his features. He lowered his gaze for a moment, collecting his thoughts before meeting her eyes again. "I didn't have a choice, Celine. There were things happening that I couldn't control. I thought it would be easier if I just disappeared." She shook her head slowly, trying to understand. "Easier for who? Luca? For you? Or for me?" "Both," he said quietly. "It wasn't fair to you, to pull you into something you didn't understand. I thought by leaving, you'd have a chance to live a life free from all of it. A life without you?" She almost laughed, though it was bitter, hollow. "How could I live a life without you?" Luca's gaze softened, but there was a sadness in it now, a regret that he couldn't take back what had been done. "I never wanted you to be alone, Celine. I thought if I stayed, I'd only bring more pain, more uncertainty. I wanted you to have peace. And yet," she said softly, "you came back." Luca nodded. "Because I couldn't let you go. Not when I knew you were still in my heart. Not when I knew I was still part of you." The garden around them seemed to quiet, as if it, too, was listening. Celine could feel the weight of their shared history hanging in the air, and for the first time since his return, she felt a flicker of hope, a flicker of something that could grow into something more. "But I can't undo the past," Luca added, his voice trembling. "I can't take away the pain I caused. All I can do is try to make things right now." Celine's heart clenched at his words. She had spent so many years building walls, convincing herself that she didn't need him, that she could live without him. But now, standing here in the garden, she felt that familiar pull. The pull of what could have been, of what they still might have. And yet, there was something else. Something that told her she had to be careful. The past, with all its ghosts, still held her in its grip. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the cold stone of the bench beside her. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Luca. I don't know if I can trust you again." His face fell, but he didn't turn away. "I understand," he whispered. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I'm here, Celine. I'll wait for you, as long as it takes." And for the first time, a tear slid down her cheek, not from sadness, but from something else, something deeper, something she couldn't name. Perhaps it was the start of healing, or perhaps it was just the beginning of another chapter. Chapter 11. The Symphony's Lament. The morning fog had lifted, leaving the garden bathed in soft, golden light. A quiet stillness had settled over the land, a sense of anticipation that lingered in the air like a promise unspoken. The flowers, wet with dew, glistened in the early sunlight, their colors vibrant against the dark soil beneath. Celine stood at the edge of the garden, her eyes tracing the winding paths that had become so familiar to her over the years. For the first time in a long while, the garden no longer felt like a place of solitude or mourning. There was a new energy here now, something that vibrated in the air, a quiet hum that spoke of beginnings. It was as if the earth itself had been waiting for this moment, for the return of something lost. She hadn't expected to see Luca again so soon, but when he had appeared at the garden gate the day before, his presence had been like a shadow falling over her heart, a shadow that both comforted and confused her. There was no denying the connection between them, but there was also the weight of their history, the years of separation that hung between them like a thick veil. She wasn't sure if she was ready to lift it, but she could no longer ignore the pull he had on her. The way his words, his touch, seemed to seep into her very bones. She had spent so many years convinced that she could live without him, that she could bury the past and move on. But now, standing here in the garden that had been her sanctuary, she realized that the past could never be buried completely. It had roots that ran deeper than she had ever allowed herself to understand. A soft crunch of gravel beneath footsteps broke her thoughts, and Celine turned, her heart leaping in her chest. Luca was standing at the edge of the garden, his silhouette framed by the trees behind him. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, as it had always been, whether they had known it or not. "Good morning," he said, his voice low, but there was an unmistakable warmth in it. He was closer now, his gaze never leaving hers. Celine smiled faintly, her heart heavy with everything that had passed between them. "Good morning," she replied. Her voice felt strange in her own ears, as if it didn't quite match the emotions swirling inside her. She had no idea what to say to him. What could she say? Luca took a step forward, his eyes flicking to the flowers around them before returning to her. "It's beautiful here," he said softly, as if he were speaking to her and the garden both. "I didn't realize how much I missed this place. How much I missed you." The words stirred something deep within her, a mixture of longing and fear. She had spent so long pushing him away, so long convincing herself that she didn't need him anymore. But the truth was far more complicated. "I've been trying to figure out how I feel," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the ground for a moment, unsure of how to put her emotions into words. "How I'm supposed to feel. After everything, after all these years, I don't know if I'm ready to let myself care again." Luca's expression softened, and he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. His touch was hesitant, as if testing the waters, unsure of where they stood. "I understand, Celine. I know I've hurt you. I know I can't erase the past, but I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking for a chance to make things right. A chance to show you that I'm still here, that I'm still the man you once knew." Her breath caught in her throat as his words sank in. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the person standing in front of her was the same Luca who had once been the center of her world. But could she? Could she trust him again? Could she let herself love him without fear of losing him once more? "I've spent so many years alone," she whispered, the weight of her own words pressing down on her. "I built walls around myself, Luca. I thought I was protecting myself, protecting my heart, but now I don't know what to do with all of this." Luca reached for her hand then, his fingers brushing against hers, the warmth of his skin sending a shiver through her. "You don't have to do anything, Celine. You don't have to have all the answers right now. We can take this one step at a time." The simple honesty in his words brought a sense of peace she hadn't expected. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to take a deep breath, to exhale the tension that had built up in her chest over the years. The decision wasn't hers to make alone. It never had been. And for all the uncertainty, for all the fear, the one thing that was clear was that they were in this together. "I want to believe you," she said softly, her voice a little more steady now. "But I don't know if I'm strong enough." Luca squeezed her hand gently, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't have to be strong alone, Celine. I'm here, and I'll be here for as long as you need me." The words, though simple, were enough. They were enough to begin the process of healing, to begin the slow and painful work of rebuilding trust and love. They were enough to make Celine believe that maybe, just maybe, it was possible to start again. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know what the future holds," she whispered, "but I think I'm ready to try." Luca's smile, soft and warm, lit up his face. "That's all I'm asking for." They stood there for a moment, hand in hand, the garden around them buzzing with life, as if it, too, were celebrating the shift in their hearts. The air felt lighter now, the heaviness lifting with every passing second. "Let's start over," Celine said quietly, her voice filled with a tentative hope. "Together." Luca's hand tightened around hers, his eyes sparkling with an emotion she could not name. Together. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the garden, Celine knew that the seeds of change had been planted. What would grow from them? She wasn't sure. But for the first time in years, she believed in the possibility of something new. Chapter 12. Petals and Promises. The garden had transformed since the day Celine had first stepped into it, years ago. Where there had once been only silent echoes of memories, now there was life. New shoots pushing through the earth, flowers blooming with vibrant hues, and the steady rhythm of nature unfolding. The air was different, too, infused with the warmth of change, of new beginnings. Yet even with the growth around her, Celine felt a quiet unease deep within. Though she had taken the first steps toward healing, toward opening her heart again, something still lingered in the corners of her mind. It was as if the garden, with all its beauty, had also become a reflection of her own inner turmoil. Lush, yes, but still tangled with roots and shadows that she couldn't quite reach. It had been a week since Luca's return, and while the days had passed with moments of connection, of tenderness, there were still gaps between them. Places where words were left unsaid and glances held too much weight. There was no denying that their reunion had shifted something, that they were both treading on unfamiliar ground. But Celine could feel the old barriers rising again, and she wasn't sure how to break them down. Not yet. Today, she stood in front of the rose bushes near the garden's edge, her fingers brushing against the delicate petals as if searching for something she couldn't name. The roses had always been her favorite. Their fragrance, intoxicating and sweet, reminded her of simpler days, of moments before everything had gone wrong. But now, as she gazed at them, she felt the weight of their thorns, the ones she had hidden from for so long. Beautiful, aren't they? Luca's voice cut through the quiet, a touch of admiration in his tone. He had been silently watching her, as he often did, the way he always had when he was unsure of how to approach her. Celine glanced over her shoulder and offered him a small smile. He had been a presence at the edges of her life for days now, and though she felt a strange peace when he was near, there was also an unease she couldn't shake. The past, with its tangled threads, still seemed to follow them. "They are," she said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of a rose petal. "But I've always felt that roses have a way of hiding their true nature. Beneath the beauty, there's still thorns, aren't they?" Luca stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. He had learned to read the subtle shifts in her emotions, even when she didn't speak them aloud. He knew that she was still processing, still trying to make sense of what had happened between them and what might still come. "That's true," he said, his voice soft but understanding. "But maybe that's part of what makes them beautiful. The contrast, the strength that comes from surviving the thorns." Celine's gaze lingered on the roses for a long moment before she looked back at him. There was something in his eyes now, something that reflected her own uncertainty. They were both here, together, but neither of them knew exactly what the future held. They had been through too much, and their wounds, though hidden beneath the surface, had not yet healed. "You know," she began, her voice distant, "when I first started tending to this garden, it was because I needed something to focus on, something to fill the space that had been left behind when everything fell apart. It was a way to ground myself, to remind myself that there was still beauty in the world." Luca nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I remember. You would come out here every day, even when you didn't feel like it. It was like you were trying to prove something. I was trying to prove that I could still make something grow," Celine said, her voice quiet but firm. "That I wasn't broken. that I could still be whole, even when everything else seemed to fall apart. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of years spent apart. Celine wasn't sure if she was speaking to Luca, or if she was simply trying to make sense of her own journey. But in that moment, she realized something important, that the garden, her refuge, had been more than just a way to fill time. It had been a symbol of something deeper, her need to rebuild herself, to find a way to grow in the midst of all the darkness. "And what about now?" Luca asked gently, stepping closer until he was standing beside her, his presence warm and grounding. "What do you need now, Celine?" Celine's chest tightened at the question. The truth was, she wasn't entirely sure. Part of her longed for the safety of the past, the simplicity of a life before everything had unraveled. But another part of her, the part that had been buried for so long, wanted to reach for something more, something that felt real, even if it was uncertain. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what I need, Luca, but I think I need to stop running from it." Luca's hand found hers then, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was both familiar and new. His touch was steady, warm, something she could hold on to in the midst of her uncertainty. "You don't have to figure it all out right away," he said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "We can take this one step at a time. Together." Celine closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of his voice wash over her, grounding her in the present. She had spent so many years alone, so many years convinced that she had to do everything on her own. But now, with Luca standing beside her, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry everything alone. She opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze steady now. "I want to believe that we can rebuild," she said quietly. "That we can start again." Luca's gaze softened, and he squeezed her hand gently. "We will. We have all the time we need." For a moment, they stood there, together in the quiet of the garden, the world unfolding around them. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow on the earth beneath their feet. In that moment, it felt as though the garden itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to grow, something new. Celine didn't know what the future held, but she felt a sense of peace settle in her chest, a quiet understanding that, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Chapter 13. The veil grows thin. The days that followed Luca's return had unfolded in a quiet rhythm. The garden bloomed with the new season, its colors brightening with each passing day, as if the earth itself were responding to the changes taking place. Celine could feel the shift within herself too, though the path ahead was still unclear. Every moment with Luca, though filled with tenderness, also carried an undercurrent of unease. It wasn't that she didn't want to trust him. It was simply that trust had been broken before, and the scars left by their past had yet to fully heal. One afternoon, as she walked through the garden, she could feel the weight of their shared silence pressing down on her. She had been avoiding the unspoken questions, the ones that lingered between them like shadows, refusing to fully confront the truth of what had happened, what they had lost, and what they could still rebuild. But the quiet was becoming harder to bear. The stillness, though peaceful, now felt like a kind of cage, holding her in place. She paused by the old oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching up toward the sky. It had always been a symbol of strength in the garden, standing tall even in the harshest storms. But today, as she leaned against its sturdy trunk, it felt like a reminder of all the years she had spent avoiding the deeper truths. The roots of the tree ran deep into the earth, hidden beneath the surface, much like the emotions she had buried so long ago. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to find Luca walking toward her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. His gaze met hers, and for a moment, they simply stood there, wordlessly observing one another. There was a softness in his eyes now, a tenderness that hadn't been there before. He had always been capable of kindness, but now it was as if the weight of the past had stripped him down to something raw, something vulnerable. "How are you today?" he asked, his voice gentle but searching, as if trying to find a way to reach her. Celine sighed softly, her fingers tracing the rough bark of the tree. I don't know. Some days, it feels like everything is falling into place, like we can rebuild. But then there are moments when I can't escape the feeling that something is still missing, that something is holding me back." Luca took a step closer, his eyes dark with understanding. "You're still carrying the weight of the past," he said softly, his voice low. "I can see it in the way you hesitate, in the way you hold back." Celine felt a pang of vulnerability at his words, but there was no denying the truth in them. She had spent so much time guarding herself, keeping her emotions locked away, that even now, when she had the chance to move forward, she couldn't seem to let go of the fear that had taken root so long ago. It wasn't just about Luca. It was about the years she had spent alone, convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that she could heal on her own. "It's not just about you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's everything. The choices I made, the way I closed myself off. I don't know if I can undo all of that, if I can ever truly let go." Luca's expression softened, and he reached out, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "I'm not asking you to forget, Celine. I'm not asking you to erase the past. I'm asking you to let me be a part of your future, whatever that looks like." The simplicity of his words struck her deeply. It wasn't about erasing the hurt, the loss, or the mistakes. They couldn't be undone. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was room for something new to grow, something that could coexist with the past, not in spite of it, but alongside it. She looked up at him then, her gaze steady. "And what about you, Luca? What do you want from all of this?" Luca paused, as if considering the weight of her question. "I want a chance to make things right, a chance to show you that I'm still here, and I want to build something with you, something that's ours." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Celine couldn't find the breath to speak. She had always feared that their past would be an insurmountable wall between them. But now, as she stood there with him, feeling the warmth of his hand on her shoulder, she realized that the wall wasn't as high as she had thought. It wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about learning how to move forward together. "I don't know how we'll get there," she said softly, her voice barely audible, "but I think I want to try. I think I want to give us a chance." Luca smiled, and it was a smile that seemed to carry the weight of everything they had been through. The pain, the separation, the years of longing, and yet it was also filled with hope. Hope for the future. Hope that they could build something new from the ruins of their past. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said, his voice firm but gentle, "and we'll figure it out together." For a moment, Celine closed her eyes, letting the words settle in her chest. The past was a heavy thing to carry, but perhaps in time, it would no longer weigh her down. Perhaps, together, they could find a way to turn the shadows of the past into something that could guide them forward, rather than holding them back. When she opened her eyes again, Luca was still standing there, waiting, and this time, there was no hesitation in her heart. She reached up and took his hand, allowing herself to feel the warmth of his touch, the promise of something more. "Together," she whispered, and as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden, Celine realized that the first step had already been taken. They weren't done yet, far from it, but they had begun to rebuild, one moment at a time. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Chapter 14. Harmonic Yearnings. The morning sun rose slowly, casting a soft golden light over the garden. The air was crisp with the freshness of early spring, and the earth, rich with promise, seemed to hum beneath Celine's feet. There was something undeniably comforting about the garden, something that had always grounded her. It was here that she had learned to heal, to listen to the quiet whispers of nature, and to feel her own heart slowly begin to beat again after years of silence. But today, as Celine stood at the edge of the garden, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. The soil beneath her feet was rich with life, but there were roots buried deep within it, tangled and hidden, that had yet to be fully unearthed. She had spent so much time nurturing the garden, tending to its needs, but there was a part of her that had been neglected, parts of her own heart that she hadn't fully allowed herself to examine. As the days with Luca passed, Celine found herself at a crossroads. She had opened herself up to him in ways she hadn't thought possible. She had shared pieces of her heart, allowed herself to trust him again, but there were still fragments of her past that felt too fragile to touch. There were still moments when the fear of what had been lost, what might still be lost, crept in, threatening to undo the progress they had made. Luca had been patient, steady, always there when she needed him, but there was a distance between them now, a kind of quiet tension that neither of them dared speak aloud. It wasn't that they weren't moving forward, but the weight of the past still clung to them, like the fog that rolled in each morning over the garden, thick and slow. Today, as she knelt by the flower bed, her hands working the soil, she felt the weight of her own silence more acutely than ever. She had spent so many years avoiding the deeper truths of her own heart, running from the things that scared her. But now, with Luca beside her, she realized that avoiding the past was no longer an option. They could only move forward if they were willing to face the shadows that lingered behind them. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching, and she looked up to see Luca walking toward her. His face was soft with concern, his eyes searching hers, as though he could see right through her carefully constructed walls. "Hey," he said gently, crouching down beside her. "You've been out here for hours. Are you okay?" Celine paused for a moment, her fingers still buried in the earth, as if seeking something hidden just beneath the surface. She didn't know how to put into words the way she felt, how torn she was between the desire to hold on to the safety of the past and the need to step into the future with him. "I'm fine," she said softly, offering him a small smile. "Just thinking." Luca didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press her. Instead, he reached out and placed his hand over hers, gently coaxing her to stop digging in the soil for a moment. "You know you don't have to carry all of this alone," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "Whatever it is that's holding you back, we'll face it together." Celine felt a shiver run through her at his words, a mixture of relief and fear. It was so easy to let him in, to let his presence soothe the edges of her pain, but it was also terrifying. What if, in letting him in, she allowed the past to unravel everything they were trying to rebuild? "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "but sometimes I don't even know what's holding me back." Luca's thumb brushed gently over her hand, a silent reassurance. "Then we'll figure it out together, one piece at a time." Celine closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She knew he meant every word, but the weight of her own fears felt too heavy to share. She didn't want to burden him with the darkness that had lived in her heart for so long, the fear of abandonment, the fear of loss that still lingered in the corners of her mind. But as she sat there beside him, the warmth of his hand on hers, something in her began to shift. She had spent so many years in solitude, convinced that the only way to protect herself was to close off, to keep everything inside. But maybe that wasn't the answer anymore. Maybe, just maybe, the way forward was to let someone in, to share the weight of her heart and let the light shine through the cracks. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Scared that I won't be enough. Scared that I won't be able to give you what you need." Luca's gaze softened, and he leaned in a little closer, his forehead gently resting against hers. You don't have to be perfect, Celine. You don't have to have all the answers. All I need is you. Just you. The simplicity of his words wrapped around her like a blanket, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe them. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't whole. But she was here, and she was trying. And maybe for now, that was enough. They sat there together for a long time, the world around them quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The garden, once a place of solitude and healing, had become a symbol of something more, of growth, of new beginnings. The roots beneath the soil ran deep, but there was life there, too. Life that was still unfolding, still growing, still reaching toward the light. And for the first time, Celine felt a flicker of hope. It was a small thing, barely a spark, but it was there, nestled in the depths of her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but she was beginning to believe that, whatever it was, she wouldn't have to face it alone. Luca was beside her, and together, they would figure it out, one step at a time. Chapter 15. The crescendo of farewell. The days stretched on with a quiet, almost tangible peace. The garden had become their refuge, a place where Celine and Luca could shed their doubts, if only for a moment, and breathe in the possibility of what might be. They worked side by side, hands in the dirt, tending to the flowers and the trees that had always flourished under Celine's care. But now, with Luca at her side, the garden seemed to take on a new life, one that was no longer hers alone to cultivate. It was theirs. The silence between them, once filled with tension and uncertainty, had transformed into something more comfortable, more familiar. They didn't need to speak all the time. In fact, sometimes it felt as though words were unnecessary. There was something about the way their hands moved together, how they shared the same space, the same rhythm. It was as though they were learning to communicate in a language without words, one that was built on trust and understanding. But even in the quiet, there was still something unspoken between them, something lingering in the corners of their minds, hidden just beneath the surface. Neither of them had yet dared to fully confront the reality of what they had been through, what had happened, what had changed, and what might still remain unhealed. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the garden, Celine found herself alone in the flower bed, weeding the plants that had grown wild over the past few days. The quiet hum of the earth beneath her fingers was soothing, but her thoughts were far from peaceful. She had felt it, that lingering distance between them. It wasn't as though Luca was distant or withdrawn, but there were moments when his eyes seemed clouded with something she couldn't quite place, a kind of hesitance, as if he, too, was waiting for something. She wondered if he was waiting for her to speak first, if, perhaps, the words she hadn't said were the ones that needed to be spoken. But each time she thought of it, she felt a knot form in her chest, a fear, a reluctance to face the deeper truth of their situation. What if they couldn't go back to what they had? What if the past was too much to overcome? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, and she looked up to see Luca standing at the edge of the garden, his hands shoved in the pockets of his jacket. He had been quiet lately, his presence more a shadow than a companion, and it was this silence that had begun to trouble her. She knew he was waiting for something, just as she was. The question was, were they both waiting for the same thing? Luca's gaze met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He simply watched her, as if trying to read her thoughts, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost tentative, as though he, too, wasn't sure how to bridge the gap that had quietly formed between them. Celine set aside the small trowel she had been using, brushing her hands off on her jeans. "Hey," she replied, offering him a small, uncertain smile. How's the garden looking over there? She gestured toward the far end of the yard, where the rows of herbs were starting to take shape. Luca took a step closer, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the ground, his gaze lingering on the earth beneath their feet, as though searching for something hidden there. Finally, he met her eyes again, his brow furrowed in thought. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that immediately drew Celine's attention. "I know we've been making progress, and I can see that things are changing. But I also know that there are still things we haven't talked about, things that are still between us." Celine's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she was unsure of what to say. She had known this conversation was coming, had known that eventually they would need to confront the things they had left unsaid. But the thought of it was enough to make her stomach tighten, to make the fear rise in her throat. "I've been thinking the same thing," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's so much we haven't said, Luca. So much that's still hanging in the air." Luca nodded, his expression softening as he took a step closer to her. "I don't want to keep anything between us, Celine. I know that there are things in my past, things that I haven't shared, that have affected us. And I can see that you've been carrying your own burdens too. But I think it's time we stop pretending like everything is fine when we both know it's not." The words hit her like a wave, pulling her deeper into the conversation she had been avoiding. She could feel the walls she had built around herself start to crack, the fear and the hesitation rising to the surface. She had tried so hard to protect herself, to guard her heart from the things she couldn't control, but now, standing in front of Luca, the weight of everything she had kept hidden seemed impossible to carry any longer. "I don't know if I can do this," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I don't know if I can let go of everything, if I can let go of the fear, the pain. I've spent so long protecting myself, building walls around my heart. I don't know how to take them down, not even for you." Luca's expression softened, and he reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. "You don't have to let go of everything, Celine. I'm not asking you to erase the past, but I want us to stop living in the shadows of it. I want us to move forward, together. And I know that means facing the things that scare us." Tears welled in Celine's eyes, the rawness of his words breaking through the dam she had so carefully constructed around her heart. For so long, she had carried the weight of everything alone, afraid to share her pain, her fears. But now, standing there with Luca, she realized that perhaps the only way forward was to face those things together. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Scared that I'll lose you again. Scared that I'll lose myself in all of this." Luca's thumb brushed gently over her cheek, his touch tender and reassuring. "You won't lose me, Celine. Not again. We'll take it one step at a time. Together." For the first time in a long while, Celine allowed herself to believe in that promise. It wasn't about erasing the past or forgetting the pain. It was about learning to face it, to acknowledge it, and to move forward in spite of it. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope stir within her. A small, fragile thing, but one that was beginning to grow. Chapter 16. A Haunting Resolution. The moonlight bathed the garden in an eerie glow, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the earth. The air had turned cooler, the remnants of autumn's breath still lingering in the trees. Celine stood by the edge of the garden, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the sky met the earth in a blur of violet and silver. The night was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant murmur of the world beyond the garden's walls. But there was something else, something that hummed quietly beneath it all. It had been weeks since the conversation with Luca. They had both tried to move forward, but the weight of their unspoken fears still loomed between them, like a shadow they couldn't quite shake. Even in the moments of laughter, the quiet exchanges that had once been so easy, there was a subtle tension, an unacknowledged presence that seemed to keep them just a little apart. Celine had felt it more acutely these past few days. It was as if the past was beginning to stir again, as if the walls she had so carefully built around her heart were beginning to crack, letting through the remnants of all that she had tried to bury. But tonight, standing in the garden beneath the full moon, she couldn't ignore it any longer. The garden, once a place of peace and healing, now felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, an undercurrent of something ancient and untold. The soil beneath her feet seemed to pulse with life, but also with something more, a presence that wasn't entirely her own. She could feel it, as if the earth itself was whispering to her, urging her to listen, to look deeper. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling from behind her. She turned to see Luca stepping out from the shadows, his eyes bright in the pale light. His face, though soft with concern, held a certain quiet strength, a steady anchor in the midst of the storm she felt brewing inside of her. "Celine?" Luca's voice was low, careful, as though he knew something was different tonight. Something had changed. She took a deep breath, pushing away the unease that had settled in her chest. I feel like there's something here. In the garden, something I've been missing. It's like there's more to it than I've realized." Luca's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't question her. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence warm against the cool night air. "What do you mean?" Celine turned to face him fully, her hands resting on the wrought iron fence that marked the edge of the garden. "I don't know. It's hard to explain. It's like there's something buried here. Something that's been waiting for me to find it." The words felt strange as they left her lips, and yet they felt true. There was a sense of something ancient, something untold, that clung to the very soil. The thought both terrified and fascinated her. She had always known that the garden held power, its ability to heal, to calm, to grow. But she had never considered that it might also hold something darker, something deeper. Luca studied her for a long moment, as though weighing her words carefully. Then, without a word, he reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I'll be with you," he said simply. "Whatever this is, we'll face it together." His words, as always, were a balm to her fears. But tonight, something inside of her told her that the journey ahead was going to be different. It wouldn't be just about them, about their love and healing. It would be about something far older, something rooted in the very foundation of the earth. Together, they walked deeper into the garden, the moonlight casting an ethereal glow over the path ahead. The air grew colder, and Celine felt the hairs on the back of her neck prickle, a tingling sensation that sent a ripple of unease through her body. The garden felt alive tonight, but not in the usual way. It was as if it were watching them, waiting. They reached the heart of the garden, the small clearing where the ancient oak tree stood, a silent sentinel that had witnessed countless seasons come and go. The tree's gnarled branches twisted high into the sky, its roots buried deep in the earth, as though it held secrets within its very core. Celine paused beneath its shadow, her breath catching in her throat. The tree, in its silent grandeur, seemed to call to her, beckoning her closer. There was a strange energy in the air, a palpable tension that hung between them and the tree. It was as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Luca's hand tightened around hers, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Celine nodded, though the unease in her chest only deepened. She felt as though she were standing on the precipice of something she couldn't yet comprehend, something that was both a part of her and beyond her understanding. "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but I feel like this is where it begins. Whatever's been calling me, whatever's been holding me back, It's here. In this place. Luca stepped closer, his body radiating warmth in the chill of the night. We'll find out together, he said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. I'm not leaving you. And in that moment, as the wind stirred the leaves above them and the moonlight bathed the garden in its otherworldly glow, Celine felt a shift within herself. The walls she had so carefully built around her heart were beginning to crumble, and she realized that the path ahead would not be easy. It would be filled with challenges, with darkness and light, with fears and revelations. But it was a path she had to walk. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the rough bark of the oak tree. A sudden jolt of energy coursed through her, sharp and electrifying, as if the tree itself were alive, responding to her touch. She gasped, pulling her hand back, her heart pounding in her chest. Did you feel that? She asked breathlessly, her voice tinged with awe and fear. Luca's face was pale in the moonlight, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Yes, he whispered. It's like something is waking up. Celine swallowed hard, her breath shallow. Whatever it is, it's calling me. And I think it's time to listen. They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. The garden, the tree, the earth beneath their feet. All of it seemed to hold its breath, waiting for them to take the next step. Celine squeezed Luca's hand, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the midst of the strange energy that seemed to pulse through the air. We're ready, she said, her voice steady with a newfound resolve. Together, they stepped forward toward the heart of the garden, where the secrets of the past waited to be uncovered. Chapter 17. The Bloom After Winter. The moon was high now, casting its cold light across the garden, and Celine and Luca stood together beneath the ancient oak tree. The air around them seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible energy, vibrating with a force neither of them could fully understand. It was as though the garden, the very earth beneath their feet, was alive, and it was waiting for them to make the next move. Celine's heart pounded in her chest as her fingers lingered against the rough bark of the tree. There had been a sensation, an electric pulse, the moment she had touched it. It had come without warning, sharp, sudden, and for a brief second, it had felt as if the tree were responding to her, acknowledging her presence in a way that went beyond the natural world. It was as if it recognized her, knew her in a way that sent a ripple of unease through her spine. I don't know what this is, Celine whispered, her voice trembling slightly despite herself. Her hand, still hovering near the tree's surface, felt heavy, as though it was being pulled towards something deeper within the earth. But it's something ancient. Luca stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the oak, his expression unreadable. He, too, had felt the odd energy that seemed to pulse through the ground, but he had yet to voice his concerns. His silence was a comfort, a steady presence beside her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight furrow of his brow. He was trying to understand it too, whatever it was. I feel it too, Luca admitted softly, his voice barely rising above the whisper of the wind. It's like the garden is alive in a way we never understood. Like it has a memory, a consciousness of its own. Celine nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the twisted branches above them. There was something more to this garden, more than the flowers and the trees that had once provided her solace. It was as if the land itself had a secret, something buried deep within its roots, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. She took a deep breath and stepped back from the oak tree, her gaze still fixed on it as if it might somehow speak to her. We need to find out what's hidden here. It's like something wants us to uncover it. I don't know why, but it's calling to me. Luca remained silent for a moment, as if weighing her words, before he nodded. Then let's find out. Together. The quiet resolution in his voice made Celine feel both comforted and apprehensive. She had wanted to do this on her own, to face whatever the garden held, but she knew deep down that they were in this together. Whatever was buried here, whatever had been calling to her, would not be something she could confront alone. Together, they began to walk toward the center of the garden, where the earth seemed darker, richer, as though it had been undisturbed for centuries. The soil beneath their feet was soft and yielding, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Every step they took felt heavier, as if the ground itself was pulling them deeper into its embrace. As they moved forward, Celine could feel a distinct change in the atmosphere. The tension was palpable, and the farther they ventured into the heart of the garden, the more the weight of it seemed to press down on her. The trees above them loomed like silent witnesses, their branches stretching toward the sky, while the ground seemed to stir beneath them, shifting in subtle ways. It wasn't until they reached the farthest corner of the garden that Celine stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The air here was thick, charged with a sense of anticipation, and she could feel the presence of something ancient, something older than the garden itself. It was as though the earth was whispering to her, calling her to look deeper. Luca stopped beside her, his hand brushing lightly against hers as he looked around. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur. "What's here?" Celine crouched down, her fingers brushing against the ground. The soil felt different here, cooler, denser, as if it held secrets beneath its surface. She dug her fingers into the earth, feeling a strange resistance, as if something was holding it in place, keeping it from being uncovered. Then, with a sudden pull, her fingers met something solid. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she unearthed an object, smooth, dark, and heavy. It felt wrong in her hands, as if it didn't belong to this world. She pulled it from the ground, her fingers trembling as she brushed the dirt from its surface. It was a stone, ancient, weathered, and carved with intricate symbols that seemed to twist and writhe as if alive. The markings were unlike anything Celine had ever seen before, foreign and cryptic, as though they had been etched by a hand that no longer existed. She could feel the weight of the stone, its history pressing against her skin, and she knew that it was no ordinary object. "What is it?" Luca whispered, his voice filled with awe and a hint of fear. "I don't know," Celine answered, her voice barely audible, "but it feels important, like it's been waiting here for us." She held the stone in both hands, the ancient symbols pulsing under her fingertips, as if they were responding to her touch. The energy she had felt before, the hum beneath the surface of the garden, was now intensifying, growing stronger with every passing second. It was as if the stone itself was alive, breathing, calling to something deep within the earth. Luca's gaze flicked to the stone, then back to Celine, his expression filled with concern. "Celine, I don't know what this is, but I don't think it's just a relic of the past. This thing, whatever it is connected to everything that's been happening here. It's not just a part of the garden. It's a part of you." The words struck her like a lightning bolt, and Celine felt the ground beneath her shift, as if the very earth had recognized the truth of what Luca had said. She wasn't just holding an ancient artifact. She was holding a key, something that had been buried here for a reason, and now it was awakening. With a sudden, sharp gasp, Celine felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the heart of the earth itself. The air thickened, the very atmosphere charged with an unnatural energy, and the garden seemed to come alive around them. The wind picked up, swirling through the trees, sending leaves flying in every direction. The branches above them creaked and groaned as if they were alive, bending and twisting in response to the stone in Celine's hands. And then there was a sound, a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from deep within the earth. It was a voice. Chapter 18. everlasting echoes. The whisper seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath Celine's feet, a soft, guttural murmur that vibrated through her bones. It wasn't a voice that could be heard with her ears alone. It was deeper, somehow more ancient, a resonance that spoke to something primal within her. The wind had stopped. The garden, the trees, the world itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for her to respond. Luca stepped closer to her, his gaze fixed on the stone in her hands. "Celine," he said softly, his voice trembling, "do you hear that?" Celine nodded slowly, her eyes wide as she felt the presence of something both terrifying and mesmerizing. The stone in her hands seemed to grow heavier, its ancient energy pulsing like a heartbeat, thrumming through the air around them. The whisper, faint and elusive, became more distinct, the syllables almost forming words, but the language was unfamiliar. A guttural tongue that seemed to twist and shift with every passing second. Celine's fingers tightened around the stone, instinctively trying to steady herself. Her heart raced as the world around her seemed to distort, the ground beneath her feet shifting as though it were no longer solid. The trees loomed above her like silent sentinels, their branches bending and creaking, as if the garden itself were alive, listening to the call. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting rapidly, and Celine's breath came out in visible puffs, though it wasn't just the chill of the night air. The temperature felt wrong, unnatural, as though the very essence of the garden was shifting, turning inward. "Luca," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't think this is just the garden anymore. It's something else, something ancient." Luca, his brow furrowed in concern, stepped closer, his hand reaching for her arm. "We need to leave," he urged, his voice low and steady. "This isn't safe." But Celine didn't move. The stone felt as though it were rooted to her hands, an anchor, holding her in place. The whispers, no, the voices, grew louder, more distinct, filling her head with an overwhelming sense of urgency. She could feel them pressing in on her, pushing her to listen, to understand. And then, in the midst of the cacophony, she heard a single word. Her name, Celine. The voice was unmistakable, and her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, a summons. It came from deep within the earth, but it was not of the earth. It was something older, something beyond time. It was a voice she knew. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she gasped. "No, it can't be." Luca, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear, reached for her. "Celine, what is it? What's happening?" But she couldn't answer him. Her mind was spiraling, the world around her growing hazy, as the voice that had called her from the depths of the earth began to take shape in her mind. It was a voice she had known in the distant corners of her memory, a voice that had once been familiar but now seemed foreign, twisted by the passage of time. Her hands, trembling, gripped the stone harder, as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded in this reality. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to shift and change before her eyes, rearranging themselves into new patterns, new meanings. The voice called again, its tone both sorrowful and insistent. "Celine," it whispered, "you are the key. You must unlock what has been buried." Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she felt as though the ground beneath her was no longer there. She was falling, tumbling through the darkness, as the garden, the stone, and the very world around her dissolved into nothingness. It was as though time itself had stopped, or perhaps was unraveling at the seams. And then, with a sudden jolt, she was back in the garden, standing where she had been before. But everything had changed. The trees were no longer silent sentinels. Their branches now seemed to reach toward her, as if they were alive, as if they were trying to communicate with her. The garden felt foreign, unfamiliar, and yet strangely familiar at the same time. Luca's hand was on her arm, pulling her gently but urgently. "Celine," he whispered, his voice filled with fear. "What happened? What did you hear?" She turned to look at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. I heard it," she whispered. "I heard someone calling my name, and I saw something. Someone. Beneath the earth." Luca's eyes widened in alarm. "What do you mean? Who was it?" Celine swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she tried to process the flood of images and sensations that had overwhelmed her. It was a voice. It wasn't just in my head. It was coming from the earth, from the stone. It's like someone was calling to me, telling me to unlock something, to find something buried here. Luca's grip tightened on her arm, his gaze darting around the garden, as though searching for something unseen. "This isn't normal. This isn't just some garden, Celine. Something's going on. Something that's been hidden for centuries. We need to figure out what it is, and we need to do it quickly." Celine nodded, her mind racing. She could still feel the weight of the stone in her hands, the ancient symbol shifting beneath her fingertips. The garden had always felt alive, but now it felt like something more, something dark and ancient, as though it had been waiting for her to uncover its secrets. But she wasn't ready for what she had heard. Not yet. "I need to understand," she whispered, more to herself than to Luca. "I need to know what it means. What's buried here? What I'm supposed to do." Luca looked at her, his expression softening with concern. "We'll figure it out. Together. But we need to be careful. This isn't just about the garden anymore. This is bigger than us." Celine closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words. She had always believed that the garden had a kind of magic, a healing power that could soothe her troubled soul. But now, she realized, it held something far darker, something tied to the very fabric of the earth itself. And if she wasn't careful, she could get lost in it. The voices, though faint now, still echoed in her mind, a constant hum beneath her thoughts. She wasn't sure what it all meant, but one thing was certain. The garden was no longer just a place of peace. It had become a place of secrets, of lost histories, and of echoes from a time long past. And the key to unlocking it was within her reach.